and timing, but it does seem that all people on Earth are descended from a very small original population in Africa. Curtis Marion believes they lived on the South African coastline and that it was life by the sea that forced them to change. At Pinnacle Point, South Africa, he has found caves used by early Homo sapiens ancestors during the mega-drought period. They're full of clues that hint at new ways of thinking and behaving. Here, he has found some of the earliest evidence that humans were living off the sea.
This darkish material here is ash from a fireplace, and the vast majority of this material is burnt shell. So clearly there was quite a bit of cooking of shellfish that was taking place at this exact spot. 76,000 years ago. Somebody had a nice shellfish dinner there.
Here was a population that was broadening its diet away from meat, requiring ingenuity unknown among earlier ancestors.
You go out to collect shellfish at the wrong time, you're dead. You have to be able to time your access to the coastline so that you are here when the tides are right to collect those shellfish.
The best time to collect shellfish is at extreme low tides. And to predict those, it helps to understand the cycles of the moon.
Those are the times that you want to be collecting shellfish. All the shellfish are exposed. So this water, which you see here, is out there at that point where that rock is. So the smart coastal hunter-gatherer knows how to use the moon to signal to them when to come to the coastline to collect the shellfish.
The people of Pinnacle Point were not just harvesting shellfish, they were also hunting on the plains behind the coast and gathering berries and roots. Their way of life reflected a new versatility.
The systematic use of coastal resources does suggest a cognitive complexity.
Our ancestors occupied these caves for over 140,000 years, leaving behind an amazing record of their transformation.
This site documents a change in the way that people made stone tools. At the bottom of the sequence, they made stone tools with this rough quartzite material. And then right at about 71,000 years ago, which occurs just about there in the sequence, they make a shift to making stone tools on this silkrete in the form of long, thin blades. Before flaking it, the people here were heating this material in the fire, and through heating it, improved its flakability. And that was at about 71,000 years ago. About 40,000 years older than that has been found anywhere else in the world.
The technology of our ancestors was expanding from the single all-purpose hand axe to a variety of lighter, specialized tools.
Then they started to make these kinds of things. They made tools with special little points for perforating tasks. Like this. They made others with special little chisel ends for carving tasks.
Specialized tools allowed our ancestors to get more out of their environment. But this wasn't the only change.
And at this point, we begin to see people treating stone tools as symbols. They're making them more complex than they need to be to accomplish a particular cutting task. So at this point, stone tools are no longer just tools for cutting things. They're instruments of carrying social information about their owners.
A new type of symbolic consciousness was emerging. The first evidence of decorative art made from a naturally occurring mineral called red ochre has been found at Blombos, another cave along the South African coast.
While we were excavating more or less in this area you can see over here, we found a chunk of ochre, and when we brushed up the surface of the ochre, we realized that there was actually a design on the one side. And once we looked at it in more detail, held it up to the light, we could see a cross-hatch pattern that had lines zigzagged across the surface of this flat ground surface, and also had lines across the top, through the middle, and along the bottom. And you can imagine there was enormous excitement because we did not expect to find something that might represent a symbolic image in these 75,000-year-old levels. So this really was an enormous surprise for us.
At Blombos, they've also found shells with holes drilled in them, believed to have been used for necklaces. So our ancestors were now wearing ornaments and probably painting their bodies as well.
For me, what is really important is here, for the first time, really ever, we have evidence that people can store information outside of the human brain.
It is the birth of a new type of human culture. More complex, but easier to pass on from generation to generation. "60,000 years ago, our ancestors emerged with new technology and new culture. Thousands of years of drought had forced them to change. They were ready to explore the world. As the climate improved, they started to stream out of Africa. They might have been surprised to discover continents already populated by other humans, remnants of earlier, more primitive migrations. As they moved into Asia, they might have come across Homo erectus or the tiny hobbit. There's no evidence for such a meeting, but there is one encounter we can be more certain about. As a separate wave slowly moved through the Middle East into Europe, they must have met the Neanderthals. What were those meetings like? For many years, scientists speculated that early Homo sapiens populations absorbed the Neanderthals through interbreeding. If they did, there would be traces of Neanderthal DNA in our genes today. But there was no way to detect Neanderthal DNA until researchers at the Max Planck Institute set out on a daring scientific odyssey: the quest to sequence the Neanderthal genome. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion chemical bases, the A's, T's, C's, and G's that make up our genes. Mapping that was hard enough. The idea of mapping the genome of a long-extinct species seemed pure fantasy. But that didn't stop Svante Pääbo from dreaming about it. The first problem was to get DNA from Neanderthal bones over 30,000 years old. In most cases, DNA degrades steadily over time, leaving only minute fragments.
My group is involved since over 20 years now in developing techniques to retrieve ancient DNA from fossils and old bones, because always a dream was to do the Neanderthal, our closest relative.
But finally, taking great care not to contaminate it with their own, they isolated the first piece of Neanderthal DNA. Svante's dream is now a reality. He and his team have made a draft of the entire Neanderthal genome. Now scientists all over the world can compare key parts of it to the human genome. And one such comparison is already giving us deeper insight into the Neanderthal brain, the gene called FOXP2.
It's the only gene we know of today that's involved in speech and language development in humans. We know that because if one copy is lost in a human due to a mutation, we have a severe speech problem.
When first discovered, FOXP2 created a lot of excitement. Although many animals have the FOXP2 gene, the human version is unique. Some thought it was the gene for language. We now know that complex traits like language are controlled by many genes. Yet researchers agree the human version of FOXP2 is closely tied to some of the basic motor skills necessary for speech.
And the big question was, of course, is that shared with Neanderthals or not? And when we now look at it in the Neanderthal, indeed, it looks to be identical with us.
It's tantalizing evidence that despite their mental limitations, the boy from Skladina and his people may have been able to speak. If we share the capacity for language with the Neanderthals, could we both have inherited it from the same source? A common ancestor who gave rise to both species. Who was it? With a technique called the molecular clock, scientists can now find out. That's because DNA mutates or changes at a surprisingly regular rate. By counting the differences in the genetic code of Neanderthals and ourselves, simply comparing the A's, T's, C's, and G's in our DNA, scientists can calculate how long the two species have been diverging.
We can then estimate when there was a common ancestral population, where some individuals went on to become modern humans, some went on to become Neanderthals. It's in the order of, say, 300,000, 400,000 years ago.
The timing points straight to the intriguing ancestors who left Africa 500,000 years ago and buried their dead in the hills of northern Spain, leaving a distinctive pink hand axe at the spot. This is Homo heidelbergensis, who we now know is our ancestor too. In Europe, they evolved into the Neanderthal. In Africa, groups that had not yet migrated evolved into Homo sapiens. So DNA is revealing we share a common ancestor with the Neanderthals. But do we carry some vestige of Neanderthal DNA in our genes? Proof that we absorb them by interbreeding.
Some people claim that there are some hybrids of Neanderthals and modern humans. In the genetic record, we don't see clear evidence of that. The big story is that there were Neanderthals, they were replaced by other people, and after a rather short time, we don't see any trace of the Neanderthals in Europe. And certainly today, we don't see really traces of Neanderthal genes.
With no evidence of interbreeding, it now seems more likely that as our population grew, we simply pushed the Neanderthals out of their environments.
Humans have a very intensive way of using the environment. We seem to have the ability to pump out lots of babies, and our babies seem to have a high probability of surviving. So population growth is a really important part of the human adaptation.
The arrival of Homo sapiens was not the only thing the Neanderthals had to contend with. Europe was gripped by wild climate swings. The Neanderthals were already struggling to survive.
Probably the density of Neanderthals in the landscape was very low.
And there was a good reason for that. Neanderthal technology was limited, and their energy needs were huge.
They had this big body, this big brain, living in a rather cold environment, so we have estimates of their energy consumption every day.